She simply bought an old military bag at an ordinary flea market. Inside, there was a hidden compartment that no one had known about for decades. What she found forced her to call the police immediately and uncovered a long-buried secret from the past. Subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. Martha Higgins woke before dawn, as she always did on Saturdays, long before the light crept between the houses on her quiet Seattle street. At 68, sleep came lightly and ended early, not because her body demanded it, but because her mind had learned a rhythm that no longer needed an alarm. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of her house settling, the distant hum of traffic far beyond her neighborhood, the soft ticking of the clock on her bedside table. There was comfort in the predictability of it all. Since her husband's death years earlier, routine had become both anchor and shield, something solid to hold when the rest of life felt too large or too empty. She rose carefully, pulled on worn jeans and a thick sweater, and moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Water into the kettle, tea leaves into the thermos, a slice of toast left untouched on the counter for later. The house smelled faintly of old wood and lemon cleaner, a scent she associated with safety and ownership, with a place that answered only to her. Before leaving, she checked that her small notebook was in her bag, along with her folding knife, her magnifying glass, and the thin work gloves she always wore when handling old things. These items were not tools of habit so much as extensions of her identity. They reminded her who she was now. A woman who restored what others discarded, who believed that objects carried memory and that memory deserved respect. The flea market lay on the outskirts of the city, sprawling across a cracked expanse of asphalt that once served as a warehouse lot. When Martha arrived, the sky was still heavy with early morning gray, the kind that promised rain later in the day. Vendors were setting up under patched canopies, the air filled with the sounds of folding tables snapping open and boxes being dragged across concrete. The smell of cheap coffee drifted from a food truck at the far end, mixing with damp fabric and old paper. Martha loved this hour before the crowds arrived, when the market felt like a private conversation between sellers and seekers, before voices grew loud and bargains became performances. She moved slowly down the rows, her eyes trained not on what glittered or demanded attention, but on what sat quietly, overlooked. Years of experience had taught her that the most interesting items rarely announce themselves. She paused at a table stacked with mismatched china, then at another covered in costume jewelry, her fingers brushing surfaces lightly, almost reverently. Most of it was familiar, predictable, the kind of clutter that accumulated when lives were lived long enough. She made a few mental notes, but nothing stirred that deeper pull she had learned to trust. Halfway down the third row, her attention snagged on something that did not belong with the rest. On a narrow table, pushed slightly back from the main aisle, lay a military satchel, its shape sagging with age, its once dark leather faded to a dull brown. The metal buckles were spotted with rust, but not evenly, as if the bag had been moved between different environments over the years. There were no patches or insignia left intact, only the faint outline of where something had once been sewn and later removed, leaving pale rectangles and tiny puncture marks behind. The satchel did not shine, did not promise value, but it radiated weight, both literal and otherwise. Martha lifted it carefully, surprised by the heaviness of it. An empty bag of that size should not have pulled so firmly at her arm. As she shifted it, she felt something inside knock softly against the inner wall, a dull, controlled sound that suggested solidity rather than clutter. Her fingers traced the strap, noting the thick, uneven stitches where it had been repaired by hand, not factory work. This was not a casual fix. Someone had taken time with it, perhaps in haste, but with intention. The man behind the table watched her too closely. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, his face lined more by tension than age, his eyes darting toward the aisle whenever someone passed. When Martha asked where the bag came from, he shrugged and said it had belonged to a relative, a veteran, though his voice lacked the ease of a rehearsed story. He added that he was clearing out old boxes and didn't want to take anything back home. His words came quickly, one over another, and when Martha tested the clasp, he flinched slightly and told her not to force it there. She noted the details without comment. The low price he offered without negotiation. His insistence on cash. The way his hands bore small, fresh cuts, as if from metal or sharp tools. Around his table there were no other military items, no helmets or medals, no uniforms that might support his explanation. Just this one bag, sitting alone, as if it were the only thing he truly wanted gone. Martha did not rush her decision. She had learned long ago that patience unsettled people more than confrontation. She asked for a lower price, watching his reaction. He agreed instantly, too quickly, his relief almost visible. That settled it. She handed him the bills, wrote a brief note in her notebook describing the item and the location, and carried the satchel back to her car. As she placed it in the trunk, she again heard that muted knock from inside, a reminder that the bag was not as empty as it appeared. Driving away, she caught sight of a gray sedan parked near the edge of the lot, its engine idling, the driver's face obscured by reflection. She told herself it meant nothing. Flea markets attracted all kinds. Still, when she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw the man at the table hastily packing up, his canopy collapsing faster than the others around him. The image lingered with her long after the market disappeared behind her. By the time she reached home, the sky had darkened, clouds thickening into something heavier. Martha parked in her driveway and paused before taking the bag inside. The house stood quiet, as it always did, its familiarity a comfort. She reminded herself that she had handled hundreds of strange finds over the years, that curiosity had never harmed her before. With that thought, she lifted the satchel and carried it into the garage, already planning how she would clean and restore it. She did not yet know that this simple decision, made in the soft gray of a Seattle morning, had already set events in motion that would reach far beyond her quiet life, pulling threads from a past that refused to remain buried. The garage had always been Martha's refuge, a space that belonged to her alone. As she closed the door behind her and set the satchel down on the wide wooden workbench, the familiar surroundings steadied her nerves. The single overhead bulb cast a warm, focused light, leaving the corners in soft shadow. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars of solvents, tins of polish, coiled cords, and carefully labeled boxes filled with screws, needles, and thread. On one wall hung photographs browned with age, her late husband smiling beside a half-restored dresser, her younger self standing proudly next to a chair she had refinished decades earlier. These images were not decorations so much as witnesses, reminders of patience and skill earned over time. Martha washed her hands thoroughly at the utility sink, dried them on a towel that bore permanent stains from years of use, and pulled on her gloves. She did not turn on the radio, as she often did. Something about the bag demanded quiet. The absence of sound sharpened her awareness, making every creak of the house and distant car passing on the street feel closer, more intrusive. She placed the satchel flat on the bench and began her inspection the way she always did, slowly and methodically, letting her eyes guide her before her hands intervened. The leather was dry but intact, its surface cracked only at the edges, suggesting it had been stored carefully, perhaps wrapped, perhaps hidden away from direct exposure. She rubbed a small amount of conditioner into a corner and watched the material darken slightly, absorbing it almost greedily. That alone told her the bag had not been neglected in the way truly abandoned things were. The metal buckles were rusted, but again not uniformly. Some areas gleamed faintly beneath the corrosion, as if someone had applied oil to them at some point, preserving their function even as the exterior aged. She lifted the bag and turned it over, pressing lightly along the bottom. There was a stiffness there that did not match the rest of the structure. Her fingers paused, then pressed again, more deliberately. Beneath the outer layer, something flat and rigid resisted her touch. The stitching along the base caught her attention next. The thread was a different color than the rest, thicker, and the stitches were uneven, too tight in places, too loose in others. This was not factory work. It was repair, or modification, done by someone in a hurry or under pressure. Martha reached for her phone and took a few photographs, documenting the condition as she always did before beginning any restoration. The act felt suddenly less routine, more like evidence gathering. Though she brushed the thought aside, she examined the clasp next, the source of the man's earlier anxiety. It was fused completely, the metal edges pressed so tightly together that even gentle movement was impossible. She applied a rust remover and waited, watching the liquid bead and darken as it worked its way into the seams. When she tried again, nothing moved. The clasp had not simply seized from neglect. It had been forced shut, perhaps struck with a tool, leaving faint dents along the edge that caught the light at certain angles. The decision to use the vise was not one she made lightly. Clamping an antique item always carried the risk of irreversible damage. She hesitated, weighing preservation against the growing certainty that whatever lay inside this bag had been sealed away deliberately. In the end, curiosity won, bolstered by a sense of responsibility she could not quite name. She patted the vise with cloth, secured the satchel carefully, and positioned her flathead screwdriver against the hinge. As she applied pressure, there was a sharp, dry crack, followed by another, and the metal gave way. The moment the clasp broke open, a smell escaped that made her recoil. It was not simply the odor of old fabric or damp leather. There was something sharper beneath it, a chemical tang that prickled her nose and lingered unpleasantly in the air. She stepped back, letting it dissipate, her heart beating faster now. When she leaned in again, she saw that the interior was unexpectedly neat. The lining lay smooth and taut, unfrayed, except for one section near the bottom where the fabric bulged outward slightly, forming an unnatural curve. She pressed it gently, and again felt that solid resistance beneath. Her gaze traced the seam that framed the bulge. The stitches there were crude, almost careless, as if whoever had sewn them had not cared about appearances, only about concealment. Martha straightened, suddenly aware of how quiet the garage had become. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing on damp pavement. She moved to the small window overlooking the driveway and peered out. For a moment, she thought she saw a gray vehicle at the corner, idling, but when she blinked it was gone, replaced by an empty street glistening with recent rain. She told herself she was imagining things. Fatigue and imagination could do strange things, especially when paired with a find like this. Still, she lowered the garage door fully and locked the side entrance, then returned to the bench with renewed caution. Her hands hovered over the bulge in the lining, her instincts urging patience. Whatever was hidden there had waited decades. It could wait a little longer. Martha cleaned the exterior of the bag enough to remove surface grime, careful not to disturb the interior further. As she worked, she noticed small details that reinforced her unease. A faint oil stain near the strap attachment. A crease that suggested the bag had been opened and closed repeatedly over a long period, not used casually, but accessed deliberately. This was not a soldier's forgotten satchel. It was a container, a tool. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the bag as a whole. Without its clasp, it seemed almost vulnerable now, stripped of its secrecy. Yet the bulge remained, stubborn and silent, a promise of something yet to be revealed. Martha felt the familiar thrill of discovery, tempered now by something colder. She cleaned her tools, washed her hands again, and turned off the light, leaving the satchel where it lay. Inside the house, she locked the doors and checked the windows, a habit she had not indulged in for years. As she poured herself a cup of tea, her thoughts returned to the flea market, to the man's nervous eyes and the speed with which he had folded his table. She wondered what he knew, and more importantly, what he feared. When she finally sat down, the image of the uneven stitches lingered in her mind, a quiet challenge she knew she would not ignore for long. That night, as the rain began in earnest, tapping against the roof in a steady rhythm, Martha lay awake listening. Each sound seemed amplified, each shadow heavier. In the garage, the satchel waited, its secret still hidden but closer now to the light. Whatever it contained had already begun to reach outward, touching her life in subtle, unsettling ways. And though she did not yet know it, the careful world she had built for herself was already shifting, making room for truths long buried and dangers she could no longer pretend were imaginary. Morning came reluctantly, filtered through thick clouds that dulled the light and muted the world outside Martha's house. She had slept little. Every time she drifted toward rest, her mind returned to the satchel in the garage, to the uneven stitches and the stubborn bulge beneath the lining. The rhythm of the rain had followed her through the night, steady and patient, as if echoing the waiting presence of whatever lay hidden just beyond her reach. When she finally rose, her body felt heavy, but her resolve had hardened into something clear and unyielding. She moved through her morning routine more quietly than usual, careful not to make unnecessary noise, though there was no one else in the house to disturb. As she poured tea into her thermos, she caught herself glancing toward the window that overlooked the driveway, half expecting to see a car she did not recognize. The street was empty. The silence should have been reassuring, but instead it sharpened her awareness, making every detail feel deliberate. In the garage, the satchel sat exactly where she had left it, resting on the workbench beneath the warm cone of light from the overhead bulb. It looked harmless in the daylight, almost ordinary, stripped of the mystery that had clung to it the night before. Martha knew better. She washed her hands, pulled on fresh gloves, and took a moment to steady herself. This was not the first time she had uncovered something hidden inside an object, but never before had the act felt so consequential. She selected her tools with care, laying them out neatly on the bench. A small seam ripper, its metal tip polished smooth from years of use. A precision knife with a narrow blade she reserved for delicate work. A pair of fine scissors. These were not instruments of force, but of intention. She had no desire to tear or destroy. Whatever had been placed inside that bag had been done so deliberately, and she intended to meet that intention with equal deliberation. Her fingers traced the interior lining once more, following the path of the uneven stitches. The thread was thicker than the rest, slightly waxy, and discolored in a way that suggested age rather than dirt. She pressed gently along the seam, mapping the shape beneath. It was rectangular, too precise to be accidental. Her heart quickened, but her movements remained slow. She chose a point near the edge of the stitching where the thread color shifted, marking the boundary between original construction and later alteration. As she worked the seam ripper beneath the first stitch, she felt a faint resistance, then a soft release. The thread parted with a whisper, almost soundless. She paused, listening, though there was nothing to hear but her own breathing. One stitch became two, then three. The fabric began to loosen, opening a narrow gap that revealed a darker layer beneath. This was not simply a lining sewn over an object. There was structure here, a secondary layer of leather stitched into the bag itself. When the opening was wide enough, she slipped her fingers inside and felt the edge of a hidden pocket. It was narrow and deep, its interior smooth and cool to the touch. Something heavy rested inside, wrapped tightly. She drew it out carefully, inch by inch, until the bundle emerged fully into the light. It was smaller than she had expected, but denser, its weight concentrated and deliberate. The bundle was wrapped in waxed cloth, the surface stiff and faintly glossy, the edges folded with care. A length of twine bound it tightly, knotted in a way that made Martha pause. She recognized the knot immediately. It was not decorative, nor was it something a casual hand would tie. It was practical, secure, the kind taught in environments where reliability mattered, military, maritime, or both. She turned the bundle over slowly. On one side, barely visible beneath the wax, was the ghost of a stamp, a sequence of letters and numbers partially worn away by time. She could not make it out clearly, but the impression alone was enough to send a chill through her. This was not a keepsake. This was not something sentimental. This was meant to endure. For a long moment, she simply held it, weighing not just its physical heft but the implications of its existence. She considered the possibility that it contained nothing more than old papers, perhaps records of some forgotten transaction, maybe even personal correspondence. But the care with which it had been hidden argued against innocence. People did not go to such lengths for trivial things. Martha set the bundle aside and inspected the satchel further, her mind insisting on thoroughness before commitment. She checked the side pockets and smaller compartments, finding only the expected detritus of use, a tarnished button, its design worn smooth, the broken tip of a pencil, a scrap of paper so faded it was illegible. These items felt authentic, remnants of a life lived around the bag. The bundle did not. It felt inserted, an intrusion into an otherwise ordinary history. She returned her attention to the bundle, lifting it again. The waxed cloth gave off a faint, dry scent, something like old paper and candle smoke. She carried it into the house, choosing her small study rather than the kitchen or living room. The study was quiet, enclosed, its single window facing the backyard. A heavy desk lamp cast a focused beam of light, and her magnifying glass lay waiting where she had left it. She placed the bundle on the desk and sat, hands resting on either side of it as if bracing herself. Outside, the rain had eased, replaced by a low, even hum of distant traffic. She cut the twine carefully, preserving the knot as best she could, and unfolded the cloth layer by layer. Beneath it lay another wrapping, this one paper, sealed along the edges with hardened wax. The seal bore an imprint, a symbol she could not immediately place, pressed firmly enough to remain visible decades later. Her pulse quickened. She had seen seals like this only in photographs, in books about archives and vaults. She lifted the magnifying glass and studied it closely. The lines were crisp, intentional. Someone had wanted to ensure this package remained closed until the right moment, or perhaps forever. She hesitated then, truly hesitated, the knife poised just above the seal. A thought crossed her mind that once she broke it, there would be no undoing the act. Whatever lay inside would move from hidden history into the present, and she would be the one responsible for that transition. Her hand trembled slightly, and she drew a steadying breath. The knife slid beneath the wax with a soft crackle, the seal breaking apart in brittle fragments. The paper parted, and the contents revealed themselves in a way that made Martha's breath catch in her throat. Inside were documents, folded neatly, their edges yellowed but intact. Beneath them lay a stack of old banknotes, thicker and heavier than modern bills, their surfaces stiff with age. And tucked beneath it all was a folded map, the paper heavier than the rest, creased and recreased as if it had been consulted many times. She lifted one of the documents first, handling it by the edges. Stamps marked the page, inked impressions that spoke of authority and bureaucracy. Numbers marched across the top in careful rows. This was not personal writing. This was official. Her fingers tightened involuntarily, and the document slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the desk. Fear rose in her chest, sharp and unexpected. Martha pushed back from the desk and stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound startled her, echoing too sharply in the small room. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her thoughts racing. She did not need to understand every detail to know that what she had uncovered was dangerous, not because of its age, but because of its significance. She gathered the items back into the wrapping as carefully as she could, though her hands shook now, betraying her calm. The sense that she was no longer alone with this discovery pressed in on her, heavy and inescapable. Whatever story these documents told, it was not finished. And somehow, impossibly, she had stepped into the middle of it. Standing there in the quiet of her study, the bundle once again bound but forever changed, Martha understood that her life had shifted irrevocably. The satchel was no longer just an object from a flea market. It was a doorway, and she had opened it. The study felt smaller once the seal had been broken, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer to listen. Martha stood motionless for a long moment, the desk lamp casting a bright circle over the reopened bundle, its contents now exposed in a way that made the air seem heavier. She had rewrapped the items out of instinct, but the images remained fixed in her mind. The official stamps, the unnatural weight of the old banknotes, the deliberate folds of the map. They did not belong to her world of furniture polish and careful repairs. They belonged to another time, and to consequences she could not yet fully grasp. She forced herself to sit again. Fear, she knew, could blur details, and details mattered now more than ever. With slow, controlled movements, she unwrapped the bundle once more, this time laying each item out separately, aligning edges, creating order where she could. The documents came first. There were several sheets, all of similar size, the paper thick and fibrous, yellowed evenly, as if protected from light for most of its life. The stamps were deep and authoritative, pressed with a certainty that suggested federal oversight. Dates stood out immediately, early 1930s. Her breath caught as she read them again, her mind instinctively searching memory for context. She had grown up hearing stories about that era, told in fragments by adults who had lived through it. The Depression, bank failures, desperation that pushed ordinary people into extraordinary acts. And beneath those stories, always, were darker ones, whispered rather than spoken aloud. Kidnappings, ransoms, crimes that had gripped the nation and then slipped, unresolved, into the background of history. She had been a child when some of those stories resurfaced in old newspaper retrospectives, their headlines shrill even decades later. Her fingers moved to the stack of banknotes. They were not ordinary bills, not the familiar green paper she handled every day. These were gold certificates, their design ornate, the ink faded but unmistakable. She lifted one carefully, holding it beneath the lamp. The serial numbers stood out in crisp, black, handwritten annotations visible along the margin. Someone had taken pains to record these numbers, to preserve them as evidence or insurance. The realization made her stomach tighten. This was not money meant to be spent. It was money meant to be remembered. She counted them once, then again, her movements slow and deliberate. There were more than a handful, enough to represent a significant sum in their time, perhaps life-changing, perhaps life-ending. She imagined hands passing them from one person to another under cover of darkness, the weight of them heavy with fear and expectation. The idea that they had sat, hidden in a satchel lining for nearly a century, was almost impossible to comprehend. The map lay beneath the money, folded into a compact square. When she unfolded it, the paper resisted slightly, its creases deep and well-worn. It was hand-drawn, the lines precise but personal, annotated in pencil and ink. Coordinates marked certain points, some circled, others crossed out. Words were written in the margins, short phrases that meant nothing to her yet carried an urgency she could feel even without understanding them. Drop point. Second option, if compromised. Martha leaned back in her chair, her pulse loud in her ears. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a picture she did not want, but could no longer ignore. This was not merely a forgotten cache. This was part of an operation, one that had failed or been interrupted, leaving behind fragments that had waited silently for decades. She thought of the satchel again, of the way the lining had been stitched twice, the care taken to conceal the bundle. Whoever had done this had expected betrayal, or at least uncertainty. The satchel was not just storage, it was leverage, a contingency plan sewn into leather and cloth. Her gaze returned to the documents. One page bore a list of serial numbers that matched those on the certificates. Another contained notations that looked like coded references, initials paired with dates and locations. She did not need to decipher them fully to recognize their nature. This was documentation, meant to be cross-referenced, to prove authenticity. The kind of paperwork that accompanied large sums and larger risks. A sudden wave of cold washed over her as the implications sank in. If these serial numbers were known, if they were recorded somewhere official, then the existence of this bundle connected directly to an open question in history, a missing piece. And missing pieces attracted attention, even after time had dulled most other edges. She reached for her phone without thinking, then stopped, her hand hovering over the device. Calling someone felt necessary but also dangerous. She did not yet know who should be trusted with this information or whether trust was even relevant anymore. Her eyes drifted back to the map, to a point marked near what appeared to be a body of water. Another mark lay farther inland, connected by a thin penciled line. 2 routes, 2 chances. Martha realized then that whoever had drawn this map had anticipated failure. They had planned for alternatives, for retreat. That knowledge alone changed the nature of what she held. This was not an impulsive crime. It was calculated, rehearsed, layered with contingencies. The person who had hidden this bundle had lived with fear, had expected pursuit. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping again, and moved to the window. Outside, the backyard lay empty, wet grass reflecting the dull light of the overcast sky. Nothing moved. Still, she felt exposed, as if the knowledge she now possessed radiated outward, visible to anyone who knew how to look. She closed the blinds slowly, deliberately, and turned back to the desk. Her decision came not as a single thought, but as an accumulation of understanding. These items did not belong in her care. Keeping them was not just risky, it was wrong. Whatever justice or resolution they could bring would not come from a retired woman working alone in a quiet neighborhood. It would come from institutions built to handle such weight, flawed though they might be. She began to reassemble the bundle, this time documenting what she could without disturbing it further. She photographed the serial numbers, the stamps, the map, her hands steadying as purpose replaced panic. Each click of the camera felt like a small act of surrender, a transfer of responsibility from secrecy to process. As she worked, her phone rang. The sound startled her, sharp and intrusive. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Her heart raced as she answered, holding the phone slightly away from her ear. There was nothing on the other end. No voice, no breathing, just silence. After a few seconds, the call disconnected. Martha lowered the phone slowly, her fingers numb. That was enough. Whatever doubts remained dissolved in that moment. She gathered the bundle fully, wrapping it as closely as she could to its original state, and placed it back into the metal tin she had used earlier. The weight of it seemed greater now, as if the knowledge it carried had added to its mass. She sat at the desk for several minutes afterward, staring at the closed container. The study was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It pressed in, expectant. She knew what she had to do next, even if the act frightened her. The truth had surfaced, carried forward by chance and curiosity, and it demanded acknowledgement. When she finally stood, the decision was complete. She would call the police. Not tomorrow, not after more thought, now. The past had reached into her present, and the only way forward was to bring it fully into the light, no matter what shadows that might cast. The decision to call the police did not bring immediate relief. If anything, it sharpened Martha's awareness of every second that passed between the moment she set the phone down and the moment someone would arrive. She sat at the desk with the metal tin closed in front of her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if to keep them from shaking. The silence in the house felt unnatural now, stretched thin by anticipation. Outside, the clouds hung low, muting the afternoon light and casting everything in a flat, colorless gray that made time feel suspended. When the knock finally came, it was firm, but not aggressive. A practiced sound meant to announce authority without alarm. Martha rose slowly, her joints protesting, and walked to the front door. She checked the peephole before opening it, another habit she had not indulged in for years. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their posture attentive but calm. The sight of them, real and solid, grounded her in a way nothing else had since she opened the satchel. She led them into the house, explaining briefly that she had found something unusual inside an item she purchased earlier that day. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. In the study, she gestured toward the desk where the tin waited. One of the officers put on gloves immediately, his movements careful and precise, while the other asked her to recount everything from the beginning. Martha told them about the flea market, the military satchel, the man who sold it to her. She described his nervous manner, the low price, the way he had packed up quickly after the sale. She mentioned the gray car she thought she had seen near the edge of the lot, careful to say she was not entirely certain. The officers exchanged brief glances but did not interrupt. When she finished, one of them opened the tin and examined the contents without removing them fully, his expression shifting subtly as he took in the stamps, the old banknotes, the map. "This is beyond routine," he said quietly, and stepped aside to make a call. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the house changed. Radios crackled softly. The officers asked Martha to repeat certain details, clarifying times, locations, descriptions. They asked what tools she had used, whether she had touched the documents directly, whether anyone else had been present. She answered as honestly and thoroughly as she could, aware that every word mattered now. They told her a detective would be arriving shortly, someone with experience in historical cases and financial crimes. Until then, they asked her not to leave the house and not to contact anyone else about what she had found. Martha nodded, the weight of their words settling heavily on her shoulders. She realized then that this was no longer her discovery alone. It had entered a system far larger than her quiet life. The detective arrived less than an hour later. He was a tall man in his early 50s, his hair graying at the temples, his movements unhurried. When he introduced himself, his voice was calm, almost gentle, as if he understood that urgency could unsettle as much as it could motivate. He listened as Martha told her story again, this time with more detail, his questions probing but respectful. He asked her to describe the stitching inside the satchel, the knot on the twine, the smell that escaped when she opened it. Each detail seemed to confirm something forming in his mind. When he examined the documents and money more closely, his expression grew serious. He did not explain much at first, only that the serial numbers and stamps suggested something very specific, something that would require verification at a higher level. He thanked her for calling immediately, telling her that many people would have hesitated, or worse, tried to profit from such a find. His words carried no judgment, only quiet acknowledgment. The satchel and its contents were carefully packaged as evidence, photographed, labeled, and sealed. Watching them leave her desk felt strangely like watching a part of herself be taken away, though she knew it was necessary. The detective handed her a receipt and his card, instructing her to call if she remembered anything else about the flea market or the seller. Before leaving, he paused and looked at her more closely. "Did anyone see you buy the bag?" he asked. Martha hesitated, then mentioned the man's reaction, the speed with which he packed up, the gray car she could not be sure about. The detective nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly. He told her to be cautious over the next few days, to lock her doors, to report anything unusual. It was advice delivered calmly, but it carried an undercurrent that made her heart sink. After they left, the house felt emptier than before. The study seemed stripped bare without the desk lamp illuminating the bundle, without the physical proof of what she had uncovered. Yet, the sense of danger lingered, invisible but persistent. As evening fell, Martha noticed a car drive slowly past her house, then another. She told herself it was coincidence, that she was letting fear color her perception. Still, she drew the curtains early and double-checked the locks. That night, sleep came even harder than before. She lay awake, listening to every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional rush of a car on wet pavement. At one point, her phone buzzed, a missed call from an unknown number, no voicemail. She stared at the screen for a long time before setting it down, her chest tight with unease. The following morning, the detective called. He told her that preliminary checks on the serial numbers had yielded a match, one that sent a ripple through their department. The money appeared to correspond to a list associated with a high-profile case from the early 1930s, a kidnapping that had once consumed national attention and then faded into unresolved legend. Further verification was underway, but the implications were significant. Martha sank into a chair as she listened. The past, it seemed, was no longer content to remain buried. It had reached out through a thrift store purchase and wrapped itself around her life, tightening with each new revelation. When the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at the wall, aware that this was only the beginning. The truth was moving, and somewhere, someone else knew it had been disturbed. The detective arrived the next morning, just after sunrise, when the light was still thin and pale, as though the day itself had not yet decided what shape it would take. Martha had not slept. She had spent the night drifting between the couch and the window, watching shadows move across the street, listening for sounds that might mean something or nothing at all. When the knock came, she felt neither surprise nor relief, only a dull readiness, as if some part of her had already accepted that normal time no longer applied. He entered without haste, removing his coat and setting it carefully over the back of a chair, as though this were an ordinary visit rather than the continuation of something that had begun decades before either of them had been born. His expression was controlled, professional, but there was a gravity beneath it that Martha had not seen the day before. "They have been confirmed," he said after they sat. "The serial numbers, there is no doubt now." Martha felt the words settle inside her slowly, like sediment sinking through water. She had known, of course. From the moment she saw the documents, from the instant the seal cracked open, some instinct had already reached this conclusion. Hearing it spoken aloud did not shock her. It anchored her. The detective explained carefully, choosing his words with precision. The gold certificates found in the satchel matched a portion of a ransom payment tied to a kidnapping in 1932, one of the most notorious crimes of its time. The case had dominated headlines for months. A child taken, a nation transfixed, a ransom paid under intense public pressure. Some of the money recovered, some of it never found. For nearly a century, that missing portion had remained an unanswered question. The assumption had always been that it was lost, spent, destroyed, or scattered beyond recovery. What Martha had uncovered proved something else entirely. Someone had kept it. Someone had planned for the long term. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of old newspaper clippings, blurred photographs, typed reports with language that felt distant and formal. Martha studied them slowly. Faces stared back at her from another era, their expressions frozen in black and white, unaware of how much of their story had been left unresolved. The map, the detective continued, was perhaps the most significant element. It corresponded with partial descriptions from witness statements given at the time. Mentions of a secondary location, a contingency that investigators could never confirm, until now. Martha traced one of the copied lines on the map with her finger. The shape felt familiar. She realized with a jolt that one of the marked areas lay within a few hours' drive of the city, near a stretch of land she had passed countless times without noticing. The idea that something so important had been hidden in plain sight for generations made her stomach tighten. This was not just about money, the detective said. This was about an accomplice, someone who was never identified, someone smart enough to take their share and vanish without a trace. The satchel, he explained, fit the profile. Military surplus was common in the years following the First World War, and individuals with access to logistics and supplies often knew how to modify equipment discreetly. A hidden pocket sewn into a bag was not just concealment. It was preparation. Insurance. Martha listened, her thoughts drifting briefly to her father's stories about the Depression years, how people whispered about men who suddenly disappeared, about fortunes rumored but never seen. At the time, such stories had sounded like folklore. Now she understood that some folklore was simply truth that had outlived its witnesses. The detective's voice softened as he spoke about the cold case itself. Many of the original investigators were long gone. Files had been archived, revisited occasionally by historians or journalists, but never reopened in any meaningful way. What Martha had found was not just evidence. It was leverage, a missing piece that gave context to everything else. She asked then the question she had been holding back since the phone call the night before. Are we in danger? The detective did not answer immediately. He folded his hands, considering. He said that anyone directly involved in the original crime would be dead by now. But knowledge had a way of passing down through families, especially when money was involved. The man who sold her the satchel had not acted randomly. Whether he understood the full significance of what he possessed or not, he had known enough to want it gone. That knowledge was what concerned them now. The department had already begun tracing his identity. Cameras from the flea market were being reviewed, witnesses questioned. A pattern was forming, though it was incomplete. The man had used a false name. The vehicle he arrived in did not belong to him. He had taken steps to avoid being followed, but not enough to disappear entirely. The detective paused, then asked Martha something she had not expected. Would you be willing to come with us to the location marked on the map? The question hung in the air between them. She stared at him, searching his face for reassurance or warning. He explained that her presence could help establish a clear chain of discovery, that she was not required to go, that it might be safer if she did not. But there was an urgency in his tone that suggested time mattered. Martha felt the weight of the choice settle over her. She thought of the satchel, of the hands that had sewn the hidden pocket, of the decades the bundle had waited. She thought of the phone call with no voice, the slow-moving car outside her house, the sense that someone else was paying attention now. If she stayed behind, the story would continue without her. If she went, she would see it through. She agreed. That night, she packed a small bag, her movements steady despite the tension coiled inside her. She checked the locks twice, then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea, listening to the refrigerator hum. Near midnight, there was a sound at the gate. A metallic click, subtle but unmistakable. Martha froze. She did not move toward the window. She did not call out. She waited, her breath shallow until the sound faded into silence. When she finally exhaled, she understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever had been buried for nearly a century was no longer content to remain hidden. And, by opening the satchel, she had become part of its return. They left before dawn, when the city was still half asleep, and the streets lay empty under a thin veil of mist. Martha sat in the back seat of the unmarked car, her hands folded around her bag, watching familiar neighborhoods slide past the window and give way to industrial outskirts, and then to long stretches of road bordered by dark trees. She had agreed to come with the investigators, knowing full well that once she did, there would be no simple return to the quiet anonymity she had lived in for so many years. The decision felt heavy, but not regrettable. It felt necessary, as though the path had already been chosen the moment she lifted the satchel from the flea market table. The detective sat in the front passenger seat, speaking quietly into his phone, relaying updates to other units. From fragments of conversation, Martha understood that the search for the seller had intensified overnight. Footage from nearby cameras had confirmed his presence at the market, his arrival and departure times, and the direction he had driven afterward. What they did not yet have was his true identity. He had used a name that led nowhere, an address that belonged to a demolished building, and a vehicle registered under a shell company. None of that surprised the detective. It only confirmed that the man had known enough to be cautious. As the car turned onto a narrower road, the detective twisted slightly in his seat to address Martha. He reminded her again that she was free to turn back, that her role as the discoverer of the evidence had already been documented. Martha shook her head slowly. She had not slept enough to feel fearless, but she felt resolved. The map, the documents, the money, all of it had passed through her hands. She wanted to see where it led, to stand at the place someone else had once marked as vital enough to remember for a lifetime. The location lay near a stretch of water, where forest thinned into marshland and the ground softened underfoot. When they arrived, other vehicles were already there, parked discreetly among the trees. Officers moved with quiet purpose, scanning the area, marking points on their own copies of the map. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing, a landscape defined by its refusal to draw attention. Martha stepped out of the car slowly, the uneven ground forcing her to watch each step. She studied the surroundings, comparing them to the hand-drawn map she had memorized in fragments. The curve of the water line matched. So did the cluster of trees marked by a small symbol she had not understood at first. Standing there now, she realized it represented an old marker post, long since fallen and half buried. The investigators began their search methodically, metal detectors sweeping the ground, probes testing for hollow spaces beneath the soil. Time stretched as they worked, the quiet broken only by the occasional murmur of instructions or the soft beep of equipment. Martha waited with the detective near the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the water. She imagined the night this place had last been used, the tension of footsteps approaching, the fear of being seen. After nearly an hour, one of the officers called out. They had found something. A section of ground where the soil composition changed abruptly, disturbed long ago and never fully settled. The team moved in carefully, clearing debris, digging by hand. What emerged first was rusted metal, the corner of a box eaten away by time. As more earth was removed, its shape became clear. It was a container, smaller than Martha had expected, but solid. When they opened it, the contents were sparse but telling. There were remnants of packaging, fragments of waxed paper, and beneath them a handful of items that made the detective exhale slowly. A corroded firearm, its serial number still faintly legible. A folded piece of fabric bearing a symbol that matched one found in the satchel, and at the bottom, wrapped in decayed cloth, a small leather notebook. The notebook was fragile, its pages brittle. The detective handled it with care, flipping through just enough to confirm its significance. Names appeared, written in a cramped hand. Dates, places, notations that matched entries on the documents Martha had found. This was not the full treasure some might have imagined. It was something far more valuable. It was proof. As the evidence was secured, another team worked simultaneously on the other side of the investigation. The cellar. Word came through the detective's phone in clipped updates. They had identified a likely name tied to the shell company that owned the vehicle. The name belonged to a man declared dead nearly 20 years earlier. A death certificate existed. So did a trail of inheritance that led to a grandson, a man in his 40s who had recently fallen into financial trouble. The pieces aligned with unsettling clarity. The seller had not been a random opportunist. He had been cleaning out the belongings of a relative who had lived and died under an assumed name, a man who had carried a secret until the end. The satchel had been found among those belongings, and whatever the seller understood about it had been enough to frighten him into wanting it gone. He had chosen the flea market not to profit, but to sever the connection. That connection, however, had not been severed cleanly. When Martha returned home later that day, escorted by an unmarked car, she felt the tension return the moment she stepped onto her porch. Something was different. The detective noticed it too. The gate stood slightly ajar. The grass along the side of the house was flattened in a way it had not been before. Inside, nothing appeared stolen, but the sense of intrusion was unmistakable. On the kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper. No envelope, no name, just a single sentence written in block letters. You do not know what you were holding. Martha read it twice, her hands cold. The detective took the paper without comment, his jaw tightening. He assured her that this only confirmed that they were on the right path. That fear often followed exposure, that she would not be left alone. That night, she did not stay in her house. She agreed, finally, to go somewhere safe, a small apartment arranged by the department. As she lay in an unfamiliar bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds, she thought of the man who had sold her the satchel. She wondered whether he was running, hiding, or watching. The hunt was closing in, and with it came the knowledge that the past, once disturbed, did not release its hold easily. The final days of the investigation unfolded not with sudden violence or dramatic chases, but with a steady tightening, like a net drawn slowly closed. From the temporary apartment where she had been placed for her own safety, Martha followed events through measured conversations with the detective, through fragments of information offered carefully, as if too much at once might overwhelm her. She felt older during those days, not in body, but in spirit, as though the weight of history had settled onto her shoulders and refused to lift until the truth was fully spoken aloud. The man who had sold her the satchel was found 2 days later. He had not fled the city, nor had he gone far. He had retreated instead into anonymity, staying with acquaintances under false pretenses, moving just enough to avoid patterns. When they finally brought him in, it was without spectacle. No resistance, no protest. Only a look of exhaustion that seemed to drain him the moment he realized there was nowhere left to run. The detective met with Martha the following afternoon. They sat in a small conference room, the kind designed to be neutral and unremarkable, its walls bare, its lighting flat. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, as though careful language was no longer necessary. The seller's name, he told her, was Daniel Reeves. The name itself meant nothing to her, and that was the point. It had been chosen because it carried no weight. Daniel was not the man connected to the crime. He was the inheritor of that man's silence. His grandfather, whose real name had surfaced only now through the notebook recovered at the coordinates, had been the missing accomplice in the 1932 kidnapping. Not the mastermind. Not the one who took the child, but the one who handled logistics, who arranged transport, who ensured that contingency plans existed if things went wrong. The one who took a portion of the ransom and vanished before betrayal could find him. He had lived quietly for decades under different names, moving when necessary, never drawing attention, never spending the money in ways that would raise suspicion. The gold certificates had remained untouched, their serial numbers too dangerous to circulate. Instead, they were hidden, preserved, waiting. The satchel had been his insurance policy, the map his escape route, the documents his proof in case he ever needed to bargain for his life. Daniel had discovered the satchel after his grandfather's death, buried beneath other possessions, its weight and construction immediately suspicious. He had not known the full story, only enough to understand that whatever was inside connected to something old and dangerous. Fear, not greed, had driven him to the flea market. He had wanted the object gone, not knowing that by selling it, he was completing a circle that had remained open for nearly a century. The evidence recovered from the site on the map, combined with the documents Martha found, closed the case definitively. Names long absent from official records were restored. The timeline of the crime was corrected. The final, unanswered questions that had haunted generations of investigators were, at last, resolved. For the public, the story emerged gradually, filtered through press releases and carefully worded statements. Headlines spoke of an accidental discovery, of a cold case reopened by chance. Martha read them with a strange sense of detachment. The story felt both deeply personal and entirely separate from her, as though she had been a conduit rather than a protagonist. She declined interviews. She did not want her face attached to the narrative. The detective respected that, ensuring her privacy was protected as much as possible. Still, letters arrived. Some were simple notes of thanks. Others were more unsettling, strangers projecting their own meanings onto her experience. She read a few, then stopped. The danger faded gradually. The unknown calls ceased. The feeling of being watched loosened its grip, though it never vanished entirely. When she finally returned home, the house felt both familiar and altered, like a place revisited after a long absence. The garage smelled the same. The workbench stood as it always had, yet the space where the satchel had rested felt conspicuously empty. One afternoon, weeks later, Martha received a formal letter from the department. It thanked her for her cooperation and acknowledged the role her actions had played in resolving the case. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to do with it beyond that. Recognition was not what she had sought. Closure, perhaps, but even that felt incomplete. She returned slowly to her routines. Flea markets, restoration work, quiet mornings, and she found herself looking at objects differently now. Every old bag, every sealed drawer, every uneven stitch seemed to carry the possibility of hidden lives and buried choices. She understood more deeply than before that objects did not merely outlast people. They remembered them. On a clear Saturday morning, months after everything had ended, Martha found herself once again at the same flea market. The rows were full, the air lively with voices and bargaining. She walked the aisles as she always had, her pace unhurried, her eyes attentive. She paused at a table where several old satchels lay piled together, their leather cracked, their straps frayed. For a moment, she imagined what might be hidden inside them. Then she moved on. As she reached the edge of the market, she glanced instinctively toward the place where the nervous seller's table had once stood. It was empty now, occupied by someone else selling glassware. There was no gray car idling nearby, no sense of urgency pressing in on her chest. Martha made a note in her small notebook, not about a purchase, but about a thought. She closed it, slipped it into her bag, and walked away, carrying with her the quiet understanding that some stories waited patiently for the right moment to be found, and that sometimes all it took to uncover them was a simple, accidental choice. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. New discoveries, hidden truths, and real mysteries are coming very soon. Watch our other videos to see what ordinary people uncover when they least expect it. And don't forget to share this video. Someone else needs to see this story too.